Hey, what's up, you guys? So we just finished the Into the Wilderness series at Grace. I thought it was a pretty cool series. We did 4 weeks looking at the story of the Israelites getting from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai and trying to survive in the wilderness in between. If you haven't watched them, I'm gonna link to them throughout this video, and I'll put the links in the description below too. But as I was working on this series, I realized that some of the ideas and stuff from these stories in Exodus show up in the New Testament a ton. So I thought, I don't know, why don't I actually show you some of the connections between the Old and the New Testament here. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you a couple of these connections using the software that I use all the time. The program's called Accordance, and I use it all the time when I'm preparing for my sermons because it basically gives me all the background and inside information I would need about a specific passage. I put a couple different versions back to back, so I've got the NRSV, which is a little bit more literal of a version, and then I've got the NLT, the New Living Translation, which is what we use at Grace, and then I've got the Hebrew over here. I don't read Hebrew, but you're able to see where the words line up as you go, which makes it really easy to be able to kind of do some research. You can click and read the background of the word, and it helps you do research like that. And then this over here is the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And even though the Hebrew Bible is probably more accurate to the original text most of the time, the Septuagint is useful for knowing what at least some ancient people thought the Hebrew words meant. But enough about that. We're talking about Exodus showing up in the New Testament. So first week of the series, we looked at a passage in Exodus 15 all about the Israelites discovering some bitter water, and then God shows Moses this piece of wood. He throws it in the water, and the water becomes drinkable. And so when you look at the actual language of verse 25, you realize that the word show here is actually the same root as the word for Torah. It's teach. So God taught Moses this piece of wood, but the word for wood is actually tree. So in a sense, God taught Moses a tree. You can watch the whole sermon to get a sense of why that's important. But what I talked about in the sermon was the fact that this idea of God's teachings and his wisdom and the idea of a tree, the connections with the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, those things are all connected. And so God was giving them clean water, but he was also providing an object lesson of what it means to trust in God, to actually obey his commands, to follow his wisdom. That is how you survive in this wilderness. And when you go into the New Testament, you realize that the image of the tree of life and the Spirit, they get connected in multiple ways. For example, in Revelation 4:5, there's this image of, it's this kind of vision of the throne room of God, and it says that coming from the throne are these flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And as I talked about in the sermon, the 7 torches, those are the menorah. That's the 7 branches of this candelabra that was in the temple, and that candelabra was built to look like the tree of life. And so the symbolism there, the idea that this candelabra is the Spirit of God. Sometimes it's translated the 7-fold Spirit. That's how the NLT translates it. Regardless, the idea is that this menorah is in some sense the Spirit of God, and the menorah represents the tree of life, the Spirit. It's all there. And then if you go over to Revelation 22, you get this image of the new creation and the new Jerusalem. It talks about the river of water of life coming from the throne, and then it says this: on either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Okay, so you get that image. The tree of life is for the healing of the nations. That's a connection to Genesis. But go back to Exodus and look what it says. It says, if you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what's right in his sight and give heed to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you for the healing of the nations. Isn't that cool? So right there, we've got Exodus 15 being echoed in Revelation. Okay, let's do another one. Now, I didn't preach the second week of the series, Tim Ayers did, but it was all about manna. And this idea of bread from heaven, it actually shows up a ton in the New Testament, several times. And I'll give you 2 examples of that. But basically, this bread is going to be rained down from heaven, and every day the people can go out and gather the bread, all that they want, and just enough for that day, and that's it. If they gathered too much, it would rot right away. If they tried to gather it on the Sabbath, they'd go out and there'd be nothing there. So this idea is that this bread represents God's provision for them, day by day by day. Now, this shows up in a couple different places in the New Testament. First of all, it shows up in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Did you ever realize that that was actually a reference to manna? The idea is that God gives this bread every day, just enough for the day. And so when Jesus is teaching them how to pray, he's saying, let's take a posture like the ancient Israelites of relying on God to provide every morsel of food. Another great example of this life-giving bread showing up in the New Testament is in John 6. In verse 32, Jesus says to the crowd, he says, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it's my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven." Bread from heaven, that's just like manna. It says, "For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." And they said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." And he says to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Yet again, we see trust and the provision of God going hand in hand. Anyone who comes to Jesus will not be hungry anymore, just like the Israelites being able to trust that God would give them their daily bread. I think that's pretty cool. The third week, we talked about the story of God bringing water out of the rock. This is in Exodus 17. And in this story, God tells Moses, "I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it so that the people may drink." So Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Now, you could make references to Jesus as the water of life, or the conversation that he has with the woman at the well. But the connection that I want to draw here is actually in 1 Corinthians 10. Check this out. So Paul's drawing these connections between what happened to the ancient Israelites in the wilderness and people in his own day that refused to believe God and believe in Jesus, and they were grumbling and complaining all the time. So what he says is, all of the Israelites were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food. He's talking about manna. Then he says this, "And they all drank the same spiritual drink," referring to water from the rock. He says, "For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." I did some research on this. That rock that followed them, that's weird because it doesn't show up in the story. But it turns out that around the time of Paul, there was a tradition, a Jewish tradition, that the rock that the water came out of for the Israelites actually followed them around. It was like a well, a movable well that followed them around through the wilderness. And so this tradition is something that Paul is just making reference to. Even though it wasn't in the Bible, his readers would have been familiar with it, so he makes reference to it. So that's kind of a crazy idea, the idea that, okay, the Israelites got manna from heaven every day, but they also had this well that just followed them around, which I think is really crazy and cool. Okay, last one. This one, if I'm being completely honest, was a bit of a stretch, but as I thought about it, there was one part of the story of the Amalekite battle that I didn't talk about in my sermon. And it's the very last line, actually. In verse 16, it says, "A hand upon the banner of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." As a modern American reader, I read that and I think, why? Why would God have to go to war against the Amalekites like forever? Why can't he just, let them get defeated once and then forgive them and move on? And so it kind of causes me a little bit of discomfort, right? Why is God at war with these people forever and ever and ever? Isn't he a God of grace? Well, the answer is yes. When you come to Romans, you read Romans 1, Paul kind of gives his big idea for the whole letter. In Romans 1:16, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." Here's why this is cool. When he says the one who is righteous will live by faith, he's quoting from Habakkuk 2. And Habakkuk 2 is the prophet Habakkuk bemoaning the wickedness of the nations around him. He's longing for God to save the people of Israel from the corrupt, evil people around them. Wicked people who are constantly fighting against the plans of God. People who are, these nations that are warring against what God has intended, just like the Amalekites did, right? So Habakkuk taps into this thread of the people who are opposed to the promises of God and opposed to what God has in mind. So Paul, he quotes that, and he essentially makes a reference to the fact that the righteousness of God that Habakkuk was waiting for has now arrived, and it's arrived through Jesus. Paul goes on to describe all the kinds of things that wicked people, essentially the Gentiles, what they have been doing, what these specific humans have been getting themselves into. But then he says, the righteousness from God is revealed. What Paul is doing here is he is connecting the dots between what Habakkuk was seeing in his world and all of the nations that are opposed to God. He's connecting that to what happened through Jesus. So he goes on this long list through Romans 1 of all the wicked things that people have done and the wrath of God being revealed to them. But when you look at how he describes the wrath of God, he describes it in terms of people being given over to what they want. And essentially, it's like God saying, look, if you want to give into all this wickedness, if you really want to oppose me and all the good that I want to do for you, then so be it. You can have that wickedness, and it ends up destroying them. It happens again and again in the Old Testament. It's the image of Egypt being swallowed up by the Red Sea, the forces of chaos being destroyed by chaos. I made a big point of that in my sermon about Exodus 15 last year, if you're curious about that. But essentially what Paul is saying is that through Jesus, all of these wicked opponents of God are now being given grace and are now welcomed into the family of God. Look at this. Look what he says in chapter 2 of Romans. Paul says this. He says, there will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. In other words, if you're going to give yourself over to evil and wickedness, then you're going to reap what you sow. You're going to get what's coming to you, not because God's going to blast you, but because the way of wickedness is directly opposed to the way of life, to the tree of life. But he says this. He says, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also for the Greek, for God shows no partiality. So here is the connection back to Exodus 17. In Exodus 17, it says that God is going to be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. But in Romans 1 and 2, Paul is essentially saying, in fact, God, in his mercy, has declared that war over and has instead offered forgiveness to those same Amalekites, to the people opposed to God's promises, to the opponents of God. Anyone, Jew or Gentile, who chooses to trust in God, to take from the tree of life, to listen to God's instructions and to align our lives with him, anyone can now receive life, eternal life, through Jesus. So again, I don't know, it's a bit of a stretch. There's no direct correspondence that I could find of the Amalekites and the New Testament, but I think the theme is there, in my mind at least. Maybe it's just because I took a Romans class in seminary recently, but I made that connection in my mind and I thought, okay, that counts. That kind of counts. If you have other connections that maybe sprang to your mind as we were going through this sermon series, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to know what your thoughts are, because you know what? This is cool stuff and it's fun to learn together. So hope that was enjoyable, and I will see you on the next video.